morning, students. Welcome to the Foundations of Cognitive Robotics. In my last lecture, I told you about the top part of the human brain. Now today, I am going to take a look inside what's there in a human brain. Some of the things that are hidden from the top, we are going to find out that what is there inside it. To begin with, I will first talk about how this entire brain system has evolved. There are some parts of the brain which are quite primitive part, some parts which are relatively more modern, and some parts which are very modern. Generally, it is considered that this part of the brain, this is more or less the primitive part of the brain. So this is the primitive part, very primitive part. You can even see it in some of the very primitive organisms also. So this is the primitive part. Okay. So this is the primitive part. Whereas there is some part which is somewhere here, you may say, that which is relatively in the middle phase of development. So it is not very modern, but it is something which has developed after the primitive part. So this is relatively modern, I would say, and I just put it as relatively modern. Relatively modern. And there is some part which is very modern. So this is the part which is very modern. So we can just call it to be a very modern part of the brain. Now, when I have discussed about the brain structure in my last class, I have mostly focused on this very modern part of the brain, that is the telencephalon part of the brain. Now, of course, if I look at it from the other way, that is from the primitive side, then there is this important part which we will be calling as the brainstem part of it, which includes these these areas like the hindbrain, the midbrain. So that's the brainstem part of it. This is what we will be focusing more today. So the area which is above the spinal cord. Okay, and then on top of that, the brainstem part, there are also areas which are like diencephalons, and also there are some parts on top of that which are some part of the telencephalons, which also we will be discussing today, which are all relatively modern. Okay, so that also we will be discussing today. So these are the three things. One by one, we'll start from the very primitive part. We will talk about the brainstem part, where we have these rhomboencephalon part of the hindbrain and the mesencephalon part of the midbrain, then the diencephalon, and then we will gradually go towards the top, where we have the basal ganglia and we have cingulate cortex and such areas. So we will talk about them next. Now, if I actually look into the different brains, if I try to compare the brains of say something like the very higher order animals, like say the mammals, and compare it with reptiles like say turtles, now you would see that these three important parts of the brain, that is the telencephalon, midbrain, and the cerebellum part of it, they are mostly present in almost all of these. Okay, so it's not that the mammals are only having telencephalon. The same is also present in birds. It's also present in turtles. It's also present in amphibians and in fishes. And the same thing is true for the midbrain and the cerebellum part. Only thing is that the proportion of each one of them is quite different from species to species. So that is something that we have to be very careful about when we look into it. If we look at how a turtle responds, and also if you look at that how, for example, a mammal like a monkey is responding, if you compare between the two, you would see that in case of a turtle and in case of a macaque, the common part is that both takes, let's say, the input from the vision, both take it towards the hippocampus. So that's common between both of them. However, whenever we are talking about a monkey, it goes through so many different regions in the brain. So the path of the signal is quite complicated. On the other hand, if you look at the turtle, that path is very simple and straightforward relatively in comparison with the macaque. So that's where you may say that even if both of them are having the same elements, like say in the teleoencephalon where the hippocampus is there, or these sensory organs, but in one case they actually go through a vast many regions of the brain, different ganglia or ganglia like nuclei are involved in it, whereas in the turtle's case that is not involved. So the visual association is much less. That's what possibly is the major difference between the way the signals are processed by the turtle and the signals are processed by the macaque. Now all these things have very important consequences as far as the behavior of different types of animals are concerned. They are cognitively different because of that they have different ratios or proportions of the brain areas, and also they have different associations of networks in the brain areas. Now let's look into the brain structure and let's see that what are the hidden elements, and then we will go back to the slides and we will see how we can correlate between the two. If I look at the brain structure, this is what, if you remember, we have discussed in the last class also. Then you can see that if you try to remember that this was the prefrontal cortex and this is the frontal lobe part, and then you can see in the back side we have the parietal lobe, and at the very back we have the cerebellum part of it. Okay, this is all as far as if you take the brain, if you look at it from the top, this is what you are going to see. Now let us try to remove it and let us see what's there inside. So let's try to do that very carefully, and let's try to separate through the longitudinal fissure. You remember this is the longitudinal fissure. Let's try to separate one brain out at least. So that's what I'd be trying to do, and I will keep the rest out. Now if you look at this part, which is, you can still remember that this is where was our frontal cortex areas, and you can still remember that in the back side we had this temporal lobe part of it, and what is there inside which is hidden is actually the brain stem part of it. So you can see that in the brain stem we have these areas which is known as medulla oblongata. Then we have this area which is known as the pons area. Then we have the midbrain here. This you can see this is the midbrain area, and then you can see this big here. This is the area which contains the hypothalamus. That's the easiest way to note down the hypothalamus. And this is always indicating towards a gland here, which is so very important, pituitary gland, which actually controls the behavior, in terms of the hormonal behaviors. Now, and on top of this hypothalamus, we have the thalamus here, and in this side we have the pineal gland, okay, which contains the melatonins. So this is a very primitive structure of the brain, okay? And beyond these, we will be getting more and more relatively modern structures. I will talk about them one by one. But this is something that we have to keep in our mind, that the brain stem and the cerebellum, which was somewhere in this side, these are some of the very early developments of the brain. If you look at the brain then from bottom up, then as I told you that this is the brain stem part, which starts with the pons. Pons is somewhere here. Pons means a bridge, so that is somewhere here. So below that you have this medulla oblongata. So medulla oblongata, then pons, and then the midbrain, and then the thalamus. So that's the very primitive part. Now from there, if you look at this slide, something more we have added here. What we have added here is the hippocampus and the amygdalus. And then from here, if you go further up, you can see the fluid ventricles. Fluid ventricles are needed to supply the nutrition to the brain. That's added. Then if we further go here, what we can see that from the fluid ventricles, we are actually coming to the basal ganglia part of it. Okay, so once we are in the basal ganglia, we are nearly reaching towards the modern part of the brain. And then from basal ganglia, on top of it, we have the white matters. As I told you earlier, that these are highly myelinated nerves. And then above the white matter, we have the gray matter, the cortex part of it. And you can see the cerebellum in the bottom. So the best way to actually keep an idea about the brain structure is thus you can practice it, that how to grow it from the bottom till the top. Now once you practice that how this entire brain from the lower part, which is connected to the peripheral nervous system through the spinal cord, how from there the brain stem, pons, midbrains, etc., and then beyond that how it is connected, once you have got an overall idea about it, then we can actually, let us try to go one by one inside this element. So let's first focus on the brainstem itself, on different parts of the brainstem, different components and what's their functionalities. If I look at the brainstem, we can see that this is the area that we are referring to, and a very important area here is pons, and also the medulla oblongata is somewhere here, and the midbrain. So that's the part that we are talking about, which is basically posterior, or the back side part of the brain, adjoining and structurally continuous with the spinal cord. Now this part, the entire brainstem part, has important roles in terms of the regulation of cardiac and respiratory function, consciousness, and the sleep cycle. So all these things, whatever is the autonomous part of the nervous system, they are definitely controlled from here. So it consists of the three regions, as I told you: medulla oblongata, pons, and the midbrain. And this is indeed, even if it is very primitive, this is indeed a very important part of the brain, as all the nerve connections from the motor and sensory systems of the cortex from the top, that also passes through it to communicate with the peripheral nervous system. Apart from the fact that it controls many of the voluntary movements of the nerves, but also you have to also make it a point to see that all the sensory nerves, the somatosensory connections, they are actually coming through this medulla oblongata, and then the pons and the midbrain, and then they are coming to the different regions through the thalamus to the different regions of the cortex. So essentially, everything that is happening in the top part of the brain, they are all getting connected through this area. So some of the sensor signals this part itself processes, and for some it works like the passage, the connectors from which all these signals will be going towards the top part of the brain. That is something we have to keep in our mind. The first important sub-element of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. It is the lower half of the brainstem which controls the autonomic functions and connects the higher levels of the brain to the spinal cord, even though it makes up just 0.5% of the total brain weight, but yet it has a very, very important role. So it regulates some of the very basic functions that is needed to live the autonomic nervous systems, which includes respiration, cardiac function, vasodilation, and all natural reflexes like vomiting, coughing, sneezing, and swallowing. Say, for example, the respiration is carried out by the these kind of with the help of chemoreceptors. Cardiac centers are actually controlled through sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, which these medulla controls. Vasometer through the pressure receptors, baroreceptors, the blood pressure, and the reflex centers through they control all these reflex actions that I was talking about. On the top of the medulla oblongata, we have the pons region, which is a relay station between the forebrain and cerebellum that passes the sensory information from the periphery to the thalamus. And it's a Latin word of bridge because it is joining between the thalamus area, midbrain thalamus area, and the area below, that is the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. Now it also has nuclei that regulate sleep, for example, respiration, swallowing, bladder control, hearing, equilibrium, taste, eye movement, facial expressions, facial sensation, and posture. So here the pons controls some of the non-autonomous sensory systems also, not just the autonomous sensory systems. And it also contains the sleep paralysis center of the brain and plays a role in generating the dreams. So that's about the pons. Now we come to the midbrain region. So we have talked about the medulla, we have talked about the pons, and now we are in the midbrain region. Midbrain, or so-called mesoencephalon, is a portion of the central nervous system which is associated with things like vision, hearing, motor control, sleep and wake system, arousal, and of course the temperature regulation. In fact, this system is one of the most Archipelagian in origin, sharing its general architecture not only with our other primate, other groups of primate species, but also with many of the vertebrates also. And a very important region in the midbrain, where we have the substantia nigra, they actually creates dopamine, and that plays a role in motivation and habituation of species, from humans to the most elementary animals such as insects. So that is one of the important source from midbrain onwards, the dopamine production. So that's the importance of the midbrain. We have talked about the midbrain part, which is somewhere here, and now we will be going to the thalamus part of the brain, which plays a very, very important role, I will tell you later on, in terms of cognitive processes. So it's in the top of the midbrain and it's below the the cortex areas, etc. So somewhere in between, which connects between the lower part of the brain and the upper part of the brain. That's where is the thalamus is coming into the picture. The thalamus, as you can see, that it has two parts in it, the right thalamus and the left thalamus, and it is just in the middle part. It is just at the central part which connects between the cortex part and the cerebellum, and on the other hand the brain stem and everything. So it's located above the brain stem and between the cerebral cortex and midbrain, which has extensive nerve connections to both. That's what is thalamus. And it's the largest structure, which is in fact derived from the embryonic diencephalon part of it. You remember I have talked about that just below telencephalon we have the diencephalon. So this is the diencephalon part from which actually these the thalamus is actually derived. Now the main function of the thalamus is to relay motor and sensory signals to the cerebral cortex. Of course, as I told you that it works like a junction station, and except the olfactory signals. Olfactory signals are directly connected to the brain, the cortex part, but except that all other sensory signals actually travel through they have to travel through the thalamus. That's very important. Now this thalamus also has some additional parts outside, that is the epithalamus region, and the most important thing is the pineal body and the Medulla nuclei and caudate nucleus. Out of that, I will just only talk about the pineal body, which is a very important one in terms of course, reptiles. It plays a very important role in terms of the color change, for example. For the higher order animals also, pineal body has some important functions. Now you can see the position, let's say in that entire picture, you can see that this particular gland, the pineal gland, is somewhere here. You can always see that it is opposite to the hypothalamus, that big bird's beak, and the opposite to it you can see the small region here. That's where is the pineal gland. Now this is part of what you call epithalamus, and it's a dorsal posterior segment of the diencephalon. So it's the posterior, the back side of diencephalon, and that includes the medulla and other interconnecting fibers also. So the pineal gland, which is a very small pine cone shaped endocrine gland, and these actually controls the hormone called melatonin, and this hormone related to serotonin. It is secreted by the pineal gland, and it stimulates color change in the skin of reptiles. In case of mammals, the same gland is actually involved in terms of the sleep-wake and the reproductive cycles in mammals. The pineal gland has a very important role to play. So this is in one of the epithalamus systems that this pineal gland comes into picture. We have seen the thalamus part of the brain. Now let's look into this bird's beak part of it, which is known as hypothalamus. All our well-being, our homeostasis, that is controlled by the hypothalamus. It is also one of the very primitive parts of the brain. So let's look into the functions of the hypothalamus. And as I told you that very close to the beak, we have this pituitary gland, which is actually controlled. So hypothalamus controls the pituitary glands. They actually secrete the hormones, and that actually controls many of our organic behavior. So let's look into the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is, as I told you, the main role is to keep the body in homeostasis condition. So this is a homeostasis condition. That means that your body temperature, your these things like for example appetite, heart rate, blood pressure, everything it is kept under control by the homeostasis. So it actually gives you a sort of healthful, balanced bodily state. That's the role of the hypothalamus. So it has a very, very important role, and as you can see, I told you that this is the big region. That's where you have the hypothalamus, and it is so close to the pituitary gland. That's what it controls directly. So it's a part of the part where many essential functions of the body, such as the body temperature, the thrust, appetite, weight control, emotions, sleep cycles, sex drive, childbirth, BP, heart rate, production of digestive juices, and the balancing of body fluids. These are all the role of the hypothalamus. So it has a very important role to play. Now hypothalamus has actually, it's not a single monolithic thing. It has many important what you call nuclei inside the hypothalamus. Let's look into this nuclei. So some of the important nuclei are, for example, this nucleus, paraventricular nucleus. So this is one of the important nucleus, paraventricular nucleus. Then also you have dorsomedial nucleus, mammillary body. Then there is a ventromedial nucleus. So, and here there is a supraoptic nucleus. So all these, they play different important roles. For example, whatever information, the contextual information that comes through your cerebral cortex, amygdala and the hippocampus region, that actually comes to the hypothalamus. And these different regions that I have talked about, they actually also gets input from the sensory inputs. The sensory inputs are coming from the bottom side. Okay, so sensory inputs are coming towards the hypothalamus, and from the cortex you are getting the input. So from both the sides you are getting the inputs. Based on it, you are actually taking a decision, and that what is my, this tells me that what will be my set point, for example, set point I will call it. And so let's just try to keep this in our mind, that this is the part which will be part of the set point, and this is the part which are going to give us the inputs. So we compare between the set point and the input. That's what the hypothalamus is going to do, and then it takes the actions, and these actions go to the visceral motors, somatic motors, neuroendocrines, behavioral responses. So some actions goes towards the motors and towards the muscles, and some towards the secretions of different types of hormones that further controls the organs. So that is the role that is played by the hypothalamus. We have talked about thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now we will gradually enter towards the cortical region, the cerebral cortex region of the brain, and we will be just at the base of the cerebral cortex region of the brain. So if you look at it, what I am talking about, we have covered all these regions, and now we will be talking about this region where just at the base we are having, some people call it as a limbic system, the border system. But a very important part, some of the very important parts of the border systems will be the three things. One is that we will talk about here the basal ganglia part, and we will also talk about here the hippocampus part somewhere here, and we will talk about on top of it, just below corpus callosum, we have actually what you call the cingulate, particularly the anterior cingulate. Okay, so the entire cingulate cortex, that's the part beyond which the actually all other cortex that I had already discussed, the frontal, prefrontal, parietal cortex, etc. is there. So we have just then reached the cortex part of the brain. Let's look into their functions and their characteristics. One of the most important part here is the basal ganglia part, which is essentially a group of subcortical nuclei of varied origin, and you will find generally in the brains of vertebrates, including the humans, and this is situated at the base of the forebrain and at the top of the midbrain. That is where is the basal ganglia part of it. Now this is associated with a variety of functions. It controls, for example, the voluntary motor movements. You will see that if this is lost, then many of our voluntary actions that are lost. Procedural learning, for example, okay, habit learning, eye movements. Some people say a good bit of cognition and emotion. These are the things. Particularly, there is an area which is adjacent to the basal ganglia, is the amygdala, that controls many of our emotions. So what happens if the basal ganglia does not work? Then you get two different types of disorders, like the Parkinson's disease and the Huntington's disease. Now in the case of Parkinson's disease, you will be having a gradual loss of the ability to initiate the movement, whereas in case of Huntington's disease, you will be unable to prevent parts of the body from moving unintentionally. So that's what is the Huntington's disease. This is in fact a very fatal disease. Now, in most regions of the brain, the predominant classes of neurons actually use glutamate as the neurotransmitter, and it actually have an excitatory effect. On the other hand, in basal ganglia, great majority of neurons in basal ganglia actually use something called GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid, and that works like a neurotransmitter that have inhibitory effects on their target. So by nature, this is somewhat different because it works on the GABA. So if you just see some of these basic disease, for example, what happens in the Parkinson's disease. So you can see it in a very small video.
Parkinson's disease, or PD, is the second most common neurodegenerative disorder after Alzheimer's disease, and affects 1% of individuals over the age of 65. It is classified as a hypokinetic movement disorder, and occurs due to degeneration of dopaminergic neurons that project from the substantia nigra in the midbrain to the basal ganglia. The initial precipitant of neuronal death is unknown, and by the time symptoms emerge, between 50 to 80% of dopaminergic neurons have already died. The cardinal features of PD are tremor, rigidity, akinesia or bradykinesia, and postural instability, easily remembered with the mnemonic TRAP. The most essential feature for diagnosis of PD is bradykinesia, which is characterized by a reduction in both speed and amplitude of voluntary movement. This is most striking during repetitive movements like finger tapping, where taps are slowed and become progressively smaller in amplitude, or writing, where letter size decreases across the page, also known as micrographia. Bradykinesia is also manifested as a loss of facial expression, or hypomimia, reduced vocal volume, or hypophonia, and slowing with a variety of other activities including walking, dressing, and turning in bed. The tremor in PD is typically a unilateral, rhythmic, resting tremor between 4 to 6 Hz and can classically start as a pill rolling tremor of the thumb and forefinger. Rigidity is an involuntary increase in muscle tone present throughout the range of movement and can be tested by passively moving the arm, neck, or leg. If rigidity is smooth and consistent throughout, it is called lead pipe rigidity. If, however, there is a ratchet-like quality, it is called cogwheeling, which is thought to be due to rigidity superimposed on an underlying tremor. Parkinsonism also causes characteristic gait abnormalities like stooped posture, small shuffling steps, reduced arm swing, and freezing. So make sure to ask your patients and watch out for falls. PD is treated with levodopa, which is a precursor of dopamine, the neurotransmitter that is deficient in PD. An excellent response to levodopa in a patient with asymmetric tremor-predominant Parkinsonism is supportive of the diagnosis of PD. It is important to keep in mind that PD is the most common form of Parkinsonism, but patients may develop Parkinsonism from other causes, including medications such as antipsychotics, other degenerative disorders such as multiple system atrophy or progressive supranuclear palsy, and Wilson's disease, which causes copper deposition in the basal ganglia.
Alright, so we have reached up to the basal ganglia, which is at the base of the cortex. Now, in the cortex, particularly near the temporal lobe, we have a very important region called hippocampus, which is very, very important in terms of the memory of the brain system. So let's look into the hippocampus region. We'll now look into the hippocampus region, which has a major role in learning and memory. And even though it is situated in the temporal lobe, it is essentially a part of the border part of the brain in the limbic lobe. And it has also roles in terms of spatial navigation, emotional behavior, so not just the memory, and regulation of some of the hypothalamic functions. And it's the biggest source of the theta rhythm. This is important. You have to keep in your mind At a later stage, we will see in terms of the origin of the theta rhythm and its use, hippocampus is one of the biggest source in terms of the theta rhythm. You can see the position of the hippocampus here. So it is, that's the hypothalamus region, and then on top of it, you can see the hippocampus. So that's the way. So it is, it has connections with thalamus and also with the hypothalamus. This entire region together, you have the hippocampus. Well, the next important one is actually the cingulate cortex, without which we cannot in fact develop the cognitive model of brain. So cingulate cortex plays a very important role in developing the cognitive model of brain. Now, this is on the medial side or inner side of the cerebral cortex. As I told you that it's in the inner side. And it consists of cingulate gyrus, that's the top part, upper part, the peaks, and its continuation into the cingulate sulcus. So you remember, I hope, that the gyrus and the sulcus, the peak and the valleys, the peak and the valleys. So both of them, you will see in the cingulate cortex. Now, this is just above the corpus callosum on the medial side of the brain, and although it doesn't fall into any of these typically frontal, parietal, occipital part, because it is just above the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum, if you remember, actually joins the left and the right side of the brain, etc. But it's an essential part of this limbic system. It is used in, for example, things like error detection. Okay. Also, it has a very important role in social evaluation. That means, what is our role in the society? It continuously testing. Increased level of consciousness. That's what without cingulate cortex you can think of it. And it has been shown that this area is greatly active in people who are emotionally more aware than other people. This part is also responsible for things like pain, memory, and learning, which are controlled in this region. We have talked about some of the hidden brain elements. We have also earlier talked about the cortex. Now, it's the combination of all of these things together that actually makes the whole brain function. Towards this direction, different people have tried to develop different models. There are some very early models in 1960 where people tried to actually, we call it the Mclean model, where it is developed in terms of the brain is developed as a triunion model of three parts, that is the reptile part of the brain, then the paleo-mammal part of the brain, and that is the very early mammal part of the brain, and then the primate part or the neo-mammal part of the brain. However, today we know that these are not exactly the same, but we can still say, as I told you earlier, that like the brainstem part and the midbrain part, this is the part which is like you can consider it to be the primitive part of the brain. Okay, then you have the more and more as the evolution progressed, you get more and more developed part on the top side of it. But still, this model gives us some important behavioral matching. Okay, so even historically, and it's a useful concept to begin with. Let's look into this model, and then we will see what are some of the more advanced model towards this direction. If you think of the gradation of human brain, as I told you, this Mclean's model, and that talks about this triune brain, for example. Okay, the triune brain part in evolution. Now, as I told you that they try to explain the brain in terms of three parts: the reptilian brain, composed of the basal ganglia and the brainstem part, which has the medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain, etc. And that is involved with all the primitive drives related to thirst, hunger, sexuality, and territoriality, as well as habits and procedural memory. Okay, so that's the one part, reptilian brain. Then the paleo-mammal brain, which includes the hypothalamus, hippocampus, amygdala, cingulate cortex, etc. which is the center of our motivation, like emotions, memory, okay, dopamines, for example, is motivation, and behavior such as parenting. That was one of the suggestion. Of course, today we know that it's not, parenting is not only for the mammals but also for the reptile birds, for example. There are these parenting behaviors. And then this model said that there are neo-mammalian parts consists of the neocortex, which enables more higher order things like language, abstraction, reasoning, and planning. This is somewhat true that really the cortex part, the top part, that is involved with many of these important parts of the work. So this was the first attempt to describe that how different parts of the brain are involved with different nature of works. There are in fact some commonly studied conscious and unconscious brain events on the basis of these. For example, you can see the whole list and you can just read it for your reference. Some of the conscious brain events could be something like immediate memory, explicit cognition, and things like strategic control, okay, things like the rehearsed items in working memory, wakefulness and dreams, okay, intentional learning, normal vision. So these are all part of the conscious brain events. Now if you look at the unconscious brain events, then longer term memory, that's one of the unconscious brain. You don't know, but it's happening continuously. Procedural memory, the brain is keeping the procedural knowledge continuously in some areas, even without discussing with you apparently. Automatic control, for example, for all the automatic nervous systems, the sympathetic nervous systems, for example. Then the deep sleep, coma, sedation. Okay, so these are some of the things which are controlled by the unconscious brain elements. So brain events. So this is what we can keep in our mind, and you can try to find out that what areas of the brain actually control the conscious versus the unconscious brain events as a sort of an exercise. We will now talk about three of the greatest minds in brain science who have very important contributions in terms of developing the cognitive architecture of the brain. As I always told you that if you have to develop a cognitive robot, you have to understand that what is the cognitive architecture of the brain itself. So these three people have a phenomenal contribution in the field. Let's look into their proposed models and let's look into some of the modern views towards that. We will first begin our journey with Francis Crick. Many of you have heard of Francis Crick as the discoverer of DNA. He in fact got his Nobel Prize for this. But between 1979 to 2003, Crick championed something else. He worked with his collaborator Christoph Koch, and he developed a framework for thinking about the conscious mind, wherefrom the consciousness rises. His aim was to map all the concepts associated with consciousness to properties of synapses, to properties of action potentials and neurons. So in fact, this is what is called NCC, neural correlates of consciousness in the brain. So he is the first person who started focusing on the fact that there is some biological connections between the consciousness and the biological elements. And in order to know that, you have to start with the neuron itself, the neurons, action potentials, synapses, and how the neurons network. That was the first initiation towards this field. The next is also by another very famous Nobel laureate in neuroscience, that is Gerald Adler. Now Adler expressed consciousness in terms of the morphology of the brain. His theory is known as neuronal Darwinism. Is based on three basic tenets. That is, it's based on the developmental selection, experiential selection, and the re-entry part of it. Now, when for example, a child is first developing, at that time, the child is having billions of neurons in him. But at the first phase, this is the first phase of developmental selection. It involves the somatic selection of neurons. Okay, so during the growth and development. So you can see that this is where the first neurons are coming, and at the developmental phase, some of these neurons are selected and the networks are getting built, and that's what is the somatic selection phase. That's what is the developmental phase. After the developmental phase, then there comes a continuous process of synaptic selection. That means the joint selections and the reinforcement. Like you can see that this particular region, they are more reinforced, whereas this region is not reinforced. So this reinforcement starts, and that actually develop a new spatio-temporal event, a new spatio-temporal map in terms of different sections or groups of neurons. That's the second phase. So this is the phase where this exponential growth is happening. And finally, there is a very interesting process of reentrant mapping that happens. And what it tells is that consciousness is essentially a dynamic process where this reentry has to happen. Reentry means a group of neurons which will continuously crosstalk between each other, irrespective of what input is coming to one and or to the other. It will continuously, kind of in touch with each other, and that actually this reentry would actually help it in terms of predicting what will be the output of the system. So there are several reentry regions, and what Edelman said is one of the important reentry region is possibly the thalamus region of the brain. Beyond Edelman, there is another person who had enormous contribution. His name is Herbert Simon, another Nobel laureate, of course, in a somewhat different area in economics in 1978, but he is considered to be a pioneer in artificial intelligence, in decision making, cognitive psychology, and computer science. So together with Alan Newell, he built actually computer programs which can simulate the human cognition, especially ones that would solve problems with a trial and error like a generate and test system. These are called general problem solver. He has proposed a concept of blackboard architecture in which various items could be written to blackboard by different, let's say, group of neurons, nuclei, and it was visible to other systems that could read and write on the blackboard. As a model for human consciousness, this blackboard resembles the theater of consciousness. So that was one of the important contributions. Herbert Simon has also contributed towards developing a very interesting algorithm suitable for AI. And this algorithm is also known as CHREST algorithm, that is chunk hierarchy and retrieval structures. Now this is a symbolic cognitive architecture. For the first time somebody has talked about cognitive architecture, which is based on the concepts of limited attention, limited short-term memories, and chunking. So short of learning. It is essential in the architecture, and it's modeled as the development of network of nodes which are connected in various ways. Let's say you consider this graph, that first of all you are getting inputs from all the different sensory organs, eye, ear, hands, etc. Now what in the CHREST model he proposed is that there will be some feature which will be extracted from these mechanisms, and then a very interesting thing happens. So that's the first part. A stimulus is perceived and converted into a set of features. Then these features are actually sorted by the tests of the discrimination. So there is a discrimination network which sorts these features and send them to pointers to a node within the these limited term memories. So then these are the long-term memories. So from this long-term memory, they actually send the indicators of these long-term memories to the short-term memory. So that's what it actually goes here to the short-term memory. So discrimination network thinks of what are the points there, you have to connect it. Then from the address of those points comes to the short-term memory, and then finally an action might be taken by the system, if it is a new learning process, or else you start a new feature to extract. And many of these processes can be actually done parallelly, like eye movement and learning, and many of the other processes you can do it parallelly. So that's what was the CHREST algorithm. This for the first time an algorithmic model had come up, where you do first collect the features from the input, then you take them through a discrimination network, check whether you have already associated points, nodal points with this experience, and then those things where the associations are, that is the only thing you declare to the short-term memories. And if it is new, some new learning takes place, and again you go ahead for the new inputs. That's the way he tried to simulate the brain. Now there are counter examples of Simon's this kind of a AI vision, because there is no place of body in his vision. Now it seems all right that when we move, we walk, we talk, we write, we dance, all these things are controlled by the brain. So that's fine that the brain quite obviously controls the body. But the question is, how could the body influence our thinking? And it's something which is very important, because perhaps our thoughts are not as free and independent as you'd like them to be. They are indeed highly constrained, shaped by our bodies. So body not only constrains but also enables the thoughts in the way towards the which the body gets advantage out of it. So the crucial notion is to explain this process of embodiment. That is the counter to the Simon's AI logic. In fact, so there are these two logics. One group is this AI group. So this is the AI group, where the body is just a peripheral extension and the central part is the brain itself. Whereas the other group, for example, the Rolf Fire and John Bongard's group, they talk about how our body, how our different somatosensory experiences, as you can see all around us, they actually shapes our thought process in the brain. So both the approaches we will actually try to cover while designing the cognitive robot.